Cool. So thanks for joining me. My name is David, and I live in Denmark, and I'm currently in quarantine, like most people. Denmark is under full lockdown right now, and people are not supposed to go anywhere. So I'm sitting at home, and that also means that in the room next to me, my 7-month-old son might be screaming. So sometimes you might hear a baby in the background, and he's perfectly okay. His mother is with him. Um, so what I'm going to talk about today is peer feedback. I'm going to talk about specifically how to run peer feedback in an online fashion because many schools are closed right now. And I have a lot of experience with peer feedback. I've been working on this for 5 years by now. I did a PhD on peer review a couple of years ago, and then I've helped build some educational products, online software products that facilitate peer review. And then I've talked to thousands of teachers by now that's done peer review in different ways. So I'm going to talk about what peer feedback is, why it makes sense, how to do it effectively, and then I'm going to talk about specific tools, digital tools for doing it. So let's start with the basics. What is peer feedback? Well, essentially it's pretty simple. You want your students to do something. You can get them to write an essay, for example, or take a great photograph, and then they submit that piece of work. When they've submitted their work, you then let the students give feedback to each other's work. So here I'm thinking about students giving feedback to other students' work and not necessarily giving feedback to other students as persons. It's not about how good the person was, it's about how great the work they did was. And usually this happens through and according to a feedback rubric. And I'll come back to what I mean by feedback rubric and give some examples later. And then feedback isn't very useful unless you at least read it and hopefully also think a little bit about it. So the last and maybe most important step is that the students then read and reflect on the feedback and maybe even use it for something. So that's the essence. What is peer feedback? And then why do we do this? So there's many reasons. The main reason and the most important thing is that we want the students to learn. And how does this actually work? Well, one part of it is this elusive concept of critical thinking. So a lot of people talk about critical thinking. It's pretty hard to wrap our heads around, I think. But one of the things that happens with peer feedback that's a little bit surprising for me to say maybe is that when students give each other feedback, they generally don't trust each other that much. At least they don't trust each other as much as they trust the teacher's words. So that means that when a student gets feedback from their peers, they immediately think, this might be wrong. This is probably wrong. It's coming from a student. And when the student thinks that way, they also start to think about, well, how could it be wrong? And why might it be different than the truth? And then they start reading it more carefully and they start critiquing the feedback and they start arguing and discussing it. And that's exactly where the learning happens. So because students trust each other less than the teacher, you actually get a good thing out of that. You get this critical thinking training, which is kind of interesting. Another thing that you get out of peer feedback is that this is a good way to let students teach or let students learn how to give and receive feedback. We need to give feedback our whole lives, then we need to take feedback. And you can't take a class in college on giving feedback and then be over with it. It's a life skill that's really hard to learn. And peer feedback is just really good here because you get a lot of feedback and you give a lot of feedback. Another thing that's interesting, especially in relation to these rubrics, is that if you use rubrics well, your students will learn what the criteria is for good work, and they will eventually be able to self-assess. So if students completely internalize what a good essay is, for example, then when they're writing their own essay, they can think about those criteria and say, actually, my essay isn't doing this thing and that thing that it's supposed to do. So let me just fix it before I submit. And at that point, you essentially have students producing much higher quality work. And people are doing this without thinking about it. But the better you become at understanding the criteria, the better you become at producing high quality work. And then the final kind of component I have here is, and this is mostly for higher education maybe, we've just seen with my own students, for example, I've taught computer science courses in higher ed for many years, and also many of our users, that they receive fewer grade complaints. And the main reason for this seems to be that when students get anonymous, unbiased peer reviews and get the ability to talk about it with the teachers, then they actually end up understanding the feedback better, and they get a better chance of kind of discussing the validity of it before the final grade. But we can talk more about this later if it's relevant for you. I looked for some different research. I've done a lot of research on peer review, and all educational research is kind of complicated. Nobody knows anything. Everything kind of works a little bit. But I've tried to pull together a few different resources and graphs and studies and so on. One of the ones I looked at is this Education Endowment Foundation study. So they look at a bunch of different, they call teaching toolkits, like different methods for teaching. And then they rank them by different things. For example, the impact, like the impact on learning that every intervention has. And there is no peer feedback in the list. So it's not really clear in itself how peer feedback fares here. But if you sort them by impact and you look at the top 3 things, you get the 3 I mentioned here on the slide. Number 1 is feedback. So feedback is super good. The second one is metacognition and self-regulation. And for those that are not familiar with it, it's essentially asking your students and training your students to think about learning. Ask them questions such as, why am I learning this? How am I learning? What am I learning? And by being able to think critically about what you're learning and why and how, and then use that to self-regulate, you can become a much better learner. And then the last thing here on the top 3 is peer tutoring. So asking students to help each other and assist each other. And if you look at it from a bit afar, maybe you can kind of see it as this is peer feedback broken down into its components. You have students giving feedback to each other in order to foster metacognition and self-regulation in them. So while peer feedback isn't on the list itself, kind of multiple of the components involved in the process are here. Then there's another classic graph. A lot of people hate this pyramid, but most people understand the core concept of it, right? That when it comes to knowledge retention, when it comes to learning, it's not very effective to do what we're doing right now, which is a bit paradoxical, I guess. It's not very effective to just sit and observe, read and listen and consume. It's a lot better to do things. And a lot of research, also a lot of new research, is pointing to the major effects of having to teach others. There's incredible learning potential in asking students to teach others. And the problem is you learn so much from teaching others, and who's teaching every day? That's the teachers and not the students. So what if we could flip it around and actually ask the students to be the teachers? And peer feedback is partly doing that. It's not fully giving them full teacher capacity, but you're asking them to give feedback to others, which is an important part of teaching. Then I have this study that I found from David Nicol at University of Strathclyde. He's one of the biggest researchers in peer feedback. And he has this paper that I think has a really interesting perspective. And what he looks at is that there's a lot of research on peer feedback that talks about, well, if students give each other feedback, is it valid? Is it correct? Does it seem right? And they all come to the conclusion that yes, it does. What David here is doing is that he's saying, that's fine, but are you learning anything else than what the teacher would just give you? So like compared to receiving feedback from the teacher, what other learning things happen when you're giving feedback to each other? And what they conclude in this paper is that what you learn by giving feedback is more than what you learn from receiving it. Not in the sense of quantity, but it's something different as well. And I took this quote from the paper that I really like. It says, I think seeing what other people have done is more helpful than getting other people's comments on what you have already done. By looking at other people's work, you can see for yourself what you've forgotten or not even thought about. When people give feedback on yours, they generally just talk about what is there. This is a quote from a student that they interviewed, and I think it's really interesting, right? That when you see work by other people, you can see things like, wow, that's a smart way to approach the problem, or I would never have thought of this thing. But when you're getting feedback on your own work, it's always critiquing the specific things you've done. So peer feedback has kind of some other components to it that are relevant for learning. I think you can potentially hear my son being very excited in the background right now. Okay, so that was a bit about why we do peer feedback and how it affects learning. But now I'll go a little bit more practical, and I'll talk about how do you effectively design peer feedback in your classroom. So some people are teaching online, some people are teaching offline, some people are teaching middle schools, people are teaching higher education. So this will be a bit broad and a bit generic, but you can always ask me questions later. So my first recommendation is, no matter what, you should use a feedback rubric, because giving feedback is super hard, and students don't know how to do it. I would say that many teachers also don't really know how to do it, but students are especially incapable in the beginning. And that's okay, they have to learn, and feedback rubrics are the main scaffold that you can use to teach them. So I'm going to give you some examples of feedback rubric questions that have been used in peer grade by different people. So the first one here is an example of a question that's pretty complex. It's a question about some concepts and tools and models and theories, and it has a quantitative concept to it. All the other questions I'm going to show you are fully qualitative questions, but this one is actually kind of has some grading involved in it. So the question is, how good is the project at using relevant tools, concepts, models, and theories to evaluate another project? And then the worst on this scale is no tools are used. It's better if the students have used the relevant tools. It's even better, of course, if they use relevant tools. And if they have to do better than that, they have to use the relevant tools and then also explain why the tools are relevant. And finally, to go the full mile here, you have to do all of that, but also conclude what you learn. And there are many things that are not very great about this question, I think. But one of the things I think is good is that if a student is reading this question and assessing another project, and they pick one of these levels, then the receiver of that feedback will know immediately what they did well and what they should have to do to improve. If you had replaced the 5 bullet points here with bad, okay, good, really good, and exceptional, then if you get good, you have no idea how to get to very good. But because the specific levels here are annotated with exactly what's been done well and how do you improve from there on, it becomes a lot easier to use the feedback, and it becomes a lot easier to give the feedback in a useful way. Now I'm going to go into some different types of questions. So the first one here is about peer feedback for grammar teaching. Some of these I came up with on my own. Some of these I took from great teachers that showed them to me. The first one here says, find 3 places where the grammar is wrong, explain why it's wrong, and show how it could be done differently. And if you compare this to the last one, it's not at all about grading. It's actually not really a criteria in itself. It's more of a question for the reader that asks them to do something actively with the work they're giving feedback to. And by doing this, you ask them to understand some grammatical rules, find some problems in the paper, explain why they're problems, and then solve them themselves. And this is a very simple way for you to give an exercise to the students and say, do this, get a paper and do this with the paper, and then they have to go and do the actual work. So it's pretty easy for you to set up, and it's a lot more work on their hands, which is, I guess, a good thing. The other one here is which relevant technical terms are used in the assignment. It's also not really a criteria, but more of a way to get the reader to engage with the material that they're reading. Then there are questions that are a lot about self-reflection. So for example, if you had to go back and improve your own submission after giving feedback to this one, what would you change? And this will lead to 2 things. It will lead to self-reflection for the reader. They'll think about their own work again. It'll also lead to praise for the thing they're reading. It'll be like, oh, you did this thing that I really like, and I'm actually gonna go and do that myself. And the interesting thing here is that a lot of students realize that it's very hard to find mistakes in your own work, but it's a lot easier to see those mistakes you actually made when you see it in other people's work. So when they go and give feedback to others, they realize things they also did themselves, and then they can go back and fix it in their own work. And then the bottom one here is kind of a thinking hat almost exercise where you ask the students to put on a certain role, to say, imagine you're a film critic, how would you review this movie? Or imagine you're the teacher, how would you give feedback to this? Or imagine you're a business investor, would you invest in this business idea? So by asking them to take on a certain role and a certain perspective, they often become a little bit easier for them to give feedback because they can kind of step out of their own shoes for a little bit. And then the last two ones here, the first one is related to this concept of feedback, feed up, and feed forward, where if you want to make sure that your students are giving relevant feedback, it can be a good idea to first start by asking them, what are they actually trying to achieve in this piece of work? And are they succeeding with it? Because if you're asking students to give feedback on the story, for example, in an essay, or on the ideas, and they're instead giving feedback on the grammar, that's not very useful to the receiver of that feedback. So if you start by asking, what are they actually trying to achieve? What do they want feedback on? And then you can go on to actually ask them to give the feedback. And then the last one is just a classic laboratory report idea. Like, does it include all the things it has to include? If not, what is missing? And when you do peer review, of course, if all the students are reviewing each other's work, then it's a quick way for you to not have to sit and count sections in every paper. That's stuff I had about rubrics. I can always come back to this in the question section if you have more questions about it. The next step here is a hot topic of discussion often, but we've generally found that it's most effective if you make the feedback process anonymous. Some teachers will say, I don't want that. I want my students to be able to say things to each other. And if you can do that, it's obviously great. And that's probably better. The problem is most teachers are not able to get their students to write really great feedback first, like in the beginning, without being anonymous. And there's actually some research that's been done where they show that students that partake in anonymous peer review give better feedback, use the feedback more, and actually get higher grades. So we mainly see anonymous feedback in our tools, and that's also what I would recommend. If you want to try the non-anonymous, I'll probably start by asking the students what they want, and I can almost guarantee that they'll want to be anonymous, because it's hard to give critical feedback to your friends, and this is a way to kind of get out of that problem in the beginning. Then I think it's a good idea to be in the process yourself. If you ask students to give each other feedback, they're going to be, it's pretty crazy for them, right? A lot of them are used to getting feedback from the teacher, in most cases at least, and suddenly breaking that contract and saying, now you're going to read each other's work, will leave some of them feeling a bit vulnerable maybe. So it's important that you don't say, hey, you do peer review, and then I'll just like go home or like log off. So be there in some capacity, maybe not physically right now, but at least in spirit. Read the feedback that they give each other, give them some feedback on the feedback, and so on. And relating to that last component, we often advocate that you go a step further and ask students to give feedback to the feedback that they receive. So if I submit some work and somebody gives me feedback, then I read that feedback and I write a feedback reflection or a feedback reaction or feedback to the feedback. That helps students know that somebody actually read their feedback. It helps students think about what is good feedback. And if you get critical feedback, it feels bad. In the moment you get it, you're like, that's the worst. They probably hate me. But if you have to then sit down and think about, well, why is this feedback good? Why is it bad? How could it be better? Then you start to read the feedback more carefully and take it in a bit differently. That's all my notes for now about what peer feedback is and how you do it. And then I'm going to go quickly over one of the tools we've built for this, and then I'll mention a few other tools, and then we'll open up for questions. So we have a tool called EduFlow, and EduFlow allows you to do online peer review and a bunch of other things. And essentially, EduFlow is a way to create online learning experiences where you can combine different learning activities. And one of those activities is peer review. And we've done peer review for many years, also before EduFlow. So that's kind of our niche. That's what we're really good at. But essentially, when you go into EduFlow, we offer you different what we call learning flows. And one of those is a peer review flow. Get students to submit, give each other peer reviews, and then reflect on the feedback. You could do self-review, get them to submit and review their own work. You can combine that, submit, peer review, then self-review, and then reflect on their feedback, or other combinations of these different things. To give you a bit of an idea, I'm going to show you how the interface looks when you're doing peer review as a student. So in EduFlow, you get to submit your work. You can submit a file, a text, piece of text, Google Drive stuff, links or videos. And then when the students are asked to give a peer review, they get the submission that they're reviewing on the left side of the screen. And then you can set up a rubric that they then see on the right side. And then they go through each submission. By default, it's anonymous, but you can turn that off. And then they give the feedback that they want to their peers. Then afterwards, they get to the reflection piece where they can see the reviews that they've received, anonymous or not anonymous. And then they can go read the feedback, write their reflection, and kind of go on. So that's all I wanted to show you about EduFlow. I would rather that if you think this is interesting and you want to try it out, go and actually try it on your own, because that's a lot better for you to get your hands dirty. There's also other products for peer review out there. Three of the ones I want to mention are PeerGrade, and PeerGrade is also our product. PeerGrade is kind of like EduFlow, but it's only peer review. The reason I show you EduFlow and not PeerGrade is that PeerGrade is our old product, and eventually, maybe late this year, we'll discontinue PeerGrade and move everybody over to EduFlow. So if you want to have something that's built to last, you should probably just go on EduFlow now, but you can also check out PeerGrade. Then there's Peerceptive. It's also a peer review only tool like PeerGrade. You can find it at peerceptive.com. I can see that they have a free offer until June, but there's no free plan on Peerceptive after June. Both PeerGrade and EduFlow have a free plan that you can use forever. And then there's CrowdGrader, which is one of the older tools, I think, which is it's a bit grading focused, but it's pretty good. It has a free plan, also forever, up to 20 students, and then you pay per assignment after that if you want to have more students. And then it's depending on how big your class is. There's probably also a bunch of other tools out there, but these are the ones I see the most when I talk to teachers. So that's all I wanted to say. So if you want to try out EduFlow, you can go to eduflow.com, and it's going to be fully free, all the features for 4 months, and then there's also a free plan available after that. And now you can ask any question you want, either in chat or on audio, but then you have to remember to unmute first. Thanks a lot.